I'm Ann Adelist-Estrin. I'm the director of the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated. And I'm also a child and family therapist outside of Philadelphia. I work as a trainer for Boston University Medical School in the Healthy Steps for Young Children program, which trains pediatricians to look at environmental and adult risk factors and its influence on child health and development. And so I combine a lot of those pieces of my work together. I do a lot of writing and a lot of training, a lot of technical assistance. I travel around the country talking to folks about children who experience trauma, children who are living with high risk factors in their lives, and children with arrested and incarcerated parents. I've learned about how difficult it is for dependent children who have incarcerated parents, for their incarcerated parents, for the caregivers of those children, and also for all of the folks that make decisions about those children. So I'm here today to talk about trauma and how specifically trauma impacts children of incarcerated parents, and how the court and systems that serve children of incarcerated parents can pay attention to the issue of trauma when making decisions about these children and their families. Historically, trauma has been defined by what causes it and reactions to it. So the diagnostic and statistical manual that's used by therapists to diagnose a post-traumatic stress reaction insists that PTSD be linked to specific events. So in defining trauma, a lot of professionals look at the kinds of things that cause a sense of danger, alarm, and perceived threat to a child or an adult. The list of events that cause that kind of alarm and threat are things like witnessing an accident, a natural disaster, rape, exposure to domestic violence, and particularly for children in child welfare, child sexual or physical abuse. We have yet to see parental incarceration added to that list of traumatic events. But what those of us that work with children who have incarcerated parents realize, and have realized for some time, is that their behaviors are identical to the behaviors of most children who have experienced trauma. Another consideration in defining trauma that I think is really important is the cognitive development of children. So when you talk about something being traumatic, having to be life-threatening, it's very important to remember that children, especially children under 7, have a very distorted view of what is life-threatening, of death. Victor Carrion at Stanford University talks about the fact that for young children, the sudden removal or loss or absence of a parent can create the stress hormone reaction in a young child that's equivalent to an adult being held at gunpoint. And so when we consider that what is traumatic for some children may not seem so traumatic to the adults around them that are making decisions about them. And the final thing I want to say about defining trauma is that we're also learning how important individual temperament and personality is in defining a traumatic reaction for children. That 2 or 3 children in the same family can respond very differently to a traumatic event. And a lot of that is being now considered in terms of the perception of danger, the perception of harm that is part of each person and each child's reaction. So what we do know about trauma is the science of what happens to the brain. When anyone is faced with danger or perceived harm, our brain excretes stress hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol. And those stress hormones set into play a series of conversations, if you will, within the brain about what to do in the face of this harm or danger. I like to think about if you're driving down the road and it's late at night and you're alone and you're driving and something jumps out in front of you and you slam on the brakes, and then you realize that whatever it was, the animal is on the other side of the road, and you're fine. All of a sudden, you feel a tingling sensation around your body. Those are the stress hormones exchanging information in the brain. For adults, as soon as you see that animal on the other side of the road, the cortisol and adrenaline is replaced with dopamine. It's the chemical. It says, you're fine, you're okay. For children, often that chemical doesn't arrive in the brain until a trusted adult is there to tell them that it's okay. And it's very important to remember that this exchange of information within the brain, the danger chemicals and the safety chemicals within the brain, happen very quickly in most traumatic events. But for children in the child welfare system who may have experienced multiple traumas, they may have experienced a lot of uncertainty, their reaction to a simple traumatic or potentially traumatic event may be different than a child who has not experienced prior trauma or prior uncertainty and difficulties with cause and effect and predictability. The loss of a parent to incarceration is often called ambiguous loss, accompanied by disenfranchised grief. The loss is ambiguous because it's unclear. The person's gone, they're not dead, they're not just living in a different household, they're not just missing, they're not doing military service, they're not doing the things that I can, as a child, attempt to understand and then calm myself down. They're gone, they're incarcerated, I can't reach them. Are they coming back? Are they coming back to me? When are they coming back? That lack of ability to understand the why, the when, the where, the how makes this loss very ambiguous. And it combines with what we call disenfranchised grief. When someone dies, there's a set of rituals, no matter what your culture, no matter what your ethnicity or religion, there's a set of rituals that are intended to comfort people in the aftermath of grief. Even when parents get divorced, there's some guidelines for how to manage children through a process of divorce. Even when parents get deployed for military service, the Department of Defense sends out materials for families to help children understand how to deal with that loss. But as one caregiver said to me, it's like a living death and no one sends a casserole. That after a real death, there's a funeral, there's a ritual, and people care about you, at least for a little while. After the incarceration of a family member, very little of that support is available for adults or for children. So this ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief changes the nature of how a family and a child can cope with the trauma of the loss. So we may have, the brain is recording this loss of the parent as a trauma because it's as dangerous to me as a young child as a terrible accident or witnessing a murder. But there's no system around me to help me right myself, to raise my level of dopamine and to understand cognitively what will happen and how I can feel comforted. The additional piece for children of incarcerated parents is sort of extending that conversation is the reaction of the systems and adults around the child, the teachers, the healthcare providers, the community in general, because there's a stigma and a shame associated with having a family member who has been incarcerated that is like no other stigma. It's like no other shame. There's a judgment that's made verbally or silently, consciously or unconsciously, by many around these children that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that the child's emotional reactions to this trauma are caused perhaps by the criminal behavior of the parent rather than the loss of the parent, that the child is better off without the parent, so we won't talk about him or her. We might as well tell the child that the parent is doing military service because there's a little more honor in that, or at college, or working up north or down south. So there's a lot of untruths that happen. And so all of this stigma and shame, leading to a conspiracy of silence within the family very often, also leads to a sense of loyalty conflict for the child. How do I, in my attempt to right myself, in my attempt to raise my dopamine level of and feel okay about this, how do I do that when everyone around me, my foster mom, my grandmother, either isn't talking about my parent at all, certainly not letting me have contact, and sometimes even saying negative things. So this package, if you will, of shame and stigma, the conspiracy of silence, the loyalty conflicts, is the wrapping that this trauma is contained in for children of incarcerated parents, making it a compounded or complicated traumatic grief. The caregiver plays a significant role in the child's ability to cope in the aftermath of trauma. Caregivers who are connected to, in some way, the incarcerated parent, or who are able to at least talk with the child about the incarcerated parent without animosity and without distress, can minimize the loyalty conflicts that will exacerbate the impact of trauma. For children who have experienced trauma, the co-relationship is with separation anxiety and ADHD type symptoms. So I think the tricky part of really assessing trauma for children is that most mental health professionals tend to look at those secondary symptoms of ADHD and separation anxiety for children, and then for adults, depression and anxiety, as the primary diagnosis, which sets into play a series of events and decisions based on a diagnosis that may or may not be accurate. And then the last thing I want to say about sort of defining trauma is that I believe that the human organism is pre-wired to right itself. That when we see that deer crossing the street, we want to make sure we do everything we can not to hit it. When we experience a trauma, we try to figure out how to understand that trauma. For children, and also for children and for adolescents, that righting oneself leads to dopamine seeking, behaviors that are intended unconsciously by children and youth to raise their dopamine levels. For young children, it's attention-seeking behavior that's designed to bring that primary caregiver back, because remember, for young children, the only dopamine surges they're going to have are that primary caregiver. Adults, older children and adults, can get dopamine surges from lots of things around them. A sense of well-being, accomplishment, sex, chocolate. There's an arsenal of things that will raise dopamine levels for adults. But for children, it's the primary caregiver, that primary attachment, and sometimes it's two primary attachments, that will right itself, if you will, that will say to the child, all is well. Adolescents attempt to dopamine seek through drug and alcohol use, because we do know that most drugs and alcohol raises dopamine levels. I think sexuality in older children and adolescents and sexual promiscuity is also part of that dopamine seeking. So trauma happens, and we as humans try to find a way to right ourselves, to get that cortisol level down and the dopamine level up, and to find equilibrium. And again, for children in the child welfare system, that level of trauma may be higher, and the search for dopamine may take longer or be more difficult, especially if young children have been separated from their parents. So the law does not address the issue of trauma for children. It does, however, address the issue of making decisions in the best interest of the child in every case. But why is it that so often the best interest of a child of an incarcerated parent, particularly in the child welfare system, kind of assumes that it's better for the child not to have contact with the parent? And so what we can really learn from what we know about the science of trauma is that these are kids that are going to seek that dopamine level, that sense of that sense of being okay, which primarily comes from their primary attachment figures, which in most cases will be the incarcerated parent. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the primary caregiver. A child who had very regular contact with, let's say, a dad who did not live with the child can have that sense of primary attachment figure need met by that parent. I think that we're really learning a lot about children of incarcerated parents in the last couple of decades, and it's challenging that sort of personal notion that a lot of people have that the parent caused the problem that the child is having. Because in most cases, the trauma caused the problem, that the incarcerated parent really can be an asset to the child's development and well-being, and it would be in the best interest of most children to maintain contact with that parent for several reasons. Chief among them, mitigating the most negative aspects of trauma. The second reason that contact is really important is that the child is attempting to make sense of what's going on around them. And we do know from the very little research we have, but we do know that when it comes from the horse's mouth, so to speak, when the incarcerated parent talks directly to the child about what's going on, about what's happening, the child's anxiety levels go down. In a few cases where we've actually seen studies with cortisol swabbing of the cheek, when children talk with their estranged parent, it wasn't always an incarcerated parent, their cortisol levels go down. So we know that incarcerated parents have a very powerful role to play in mitigating the effects of trauma. I think that the sort of common wisdom also says that prisons are no place for kids. I mean, most adults don't really like the thought of going into a prison. So the thought of sending a child into a prison for a visit, or for judges ordering a child to visit a parent, is met with a lot of mixed emotion. The fact is, I've been watching children of incarcerated parents deal with visits in prisons for 37 years. And children do as well as the people that are caring for them, the people that take them to the visit, the people that they go home to after the visit. When children are accompanied on a visit by someone who is very supportive of the notion of a visit, who's open to talking, or not, if the child chooses not to, after the visit, and when the child goes home to a home where people are enthusiastic about how was the visit, children are not traumatized in spite of the possibility of dog sniffing and diaper searching and metal detectors. All of those things that happen in a prison are uncomfortable, they're not pleasant, but they don't have to be traumatic, and they're certainly not as traumatic for most children as the loss of a parent. So the question of decision making about contact is really, which is the worst trauma for a child? Which decision is going to help mitigate the damage of the trauma, and which decision could potentially re-traumatize a child? I will say that an exception to the general rule that children do better when they have contact with their parents are children whose parents are incarcerated for or have had a history of abuse against that particular child. Because for that child, the conventional wisdom of best practice social work has to reign, whether or not that child should have contact and whether reunification is in the plan. But for most children in the child welfare system who have an incarcerated parent, contact primarily through visits, but also through phone and letter writing, can really make a huge difference in how well the child copes in the aftermath of trauma. One of the significant challenges to judges is relying on expert testimony, especially related to trauma, post-traumatic stress reactions for children in child welfare and children of incarcerated parents. It's very important to seek out mental health professionals and expert witnesses that have a history of working with and an understanding of not only trauma in young children, attachment disruptions as trauma, but also the toxic stress that's a part of involvement in the criminal justice and child welfare systems. And so seeking out someone who can speak to all of those components of child stress for children, dependent children of incarcerated parents. So the question is often posed to me, what happens when children do not have contact with this primary caregiver parent who's the buffer from trauma and stress? And again, reactions are going to vary depending on temperament and personality, and also depending on the quality of the caregiving arrangements that kids have. But most children will continue to do what we call dopamine seeking. And hundreds of thousands of caseworkers over the years have told me about kids who age out of the system and then go look for their birth parents, or children who talk all the time about, you know, I'm going to go find my mom. I need to find out why she couldn't take care of me. I really need to understand that. That need to go back to understand, hardly ever goes away. And remember, the other way that young people will dopamine seek is through drugs and alcohol. So I'm very concerned, and through sexuality. I'm very concerned about children who don't have the opportunity to get that feeling that they need from a primary caregiver, and particularly in the absence of a solid attachment to a secondary caregiver, that they may really be at an increased risk for drug and alcohol use and abuse, and for early and promiscuous sexuality. That's the extreme. On the other end, or more in the middle, are children who are just struggling emotionally on a day-to-day with unmet needs to understand what happened, with a longing and a feeling of loss. And then we get into, how do people in general cope with unresolved emotional conflict? And typically, boys become aggressive. They act out, they get themselves into trouble, and girls can do that too, but more often will go in, become depressed, they may have eating disorders, they may have some cutting. So we start to see some additional mental health concerns with kids who are unable to resolve this conflict of need. And again, the key protective factors, our former Surgeon General David Satcher says that risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. So we always have to look at the protective factors. And when children have high level of skill and competence and confidence, when they're doing well in school, when they have strong bonds and attachment to their secondary caregivers, when they have some power over what happens to them, they have some influence, and they're allowed to make meaning of what's going on by asking questions, then we can circumvent some of these secondary mental health issues. But a lot of it still rests in that core intervention of letting them have that contact with the primary caregiver. For the most part, children who react negatively to a visit are typically not re-traumatized. They're typically reacting to the loss. They're reminded again that they have to go home. They're reminded again that they have to deal with this emptiness or this loneliness. When a parent or loved one dies and a family has monthly, annual, weekly visits to the cemetery, often children and adults have a period of mourning when they leave the cemetery. The wound is sort of reopened a little bit, the loss is fresh, there's crying, there's upset, but no one would ever say, don't go back to the cemetery. They would say it's a process, and as you're getting adjusted and used to this loss and managing the grief of it, people get upset. Another example is that children who live in two households, whether their parents were never married or they're divorced and they go back and forth between two households, often have an adjustment day. And teachers all over the world talk about Monday morning meltdown, where children come into a classroom and are a mess. Oh, must have visited dad or must have visited mom this weekend. But no one would suggest that they shouldn't see that other parent. It's only when it has to do with a parent who's incarcerated, when those sort of knee-jerk reactions kick in, that this parent cannot possibly be a good enough parent because they committed a crime. And so it's really important to remember that children are going to react to the visits in a variety of ways. Some of them will say that they're bored, that they don't have anything to say, that they really don't want to go. Some of them will say, you know, it was fine, and then they'll sort of cry themselves to sleep for a few nights. And some of them will have outright temper tantrums and get themselves into some trouble after a visit. All of these things are fairly normal reactions, though, to being reminded
in decision-making
about
loss.
Children in the child welfare system with incarcerated parents. Best practice would indicate that judges should ask about a history of trauma. Gather as much family history and history on this child as is possible. Connect with mental health professionals for assessment and treatment who have experience in dealing with trauma and the criminal justice system. Assess caregiving arrangements based on doing no harm. In other words, making sure that this child is with people who will be able to talk with them about their incarcerated parent and about the trauma, and promote connections between the child and their incarcerated parent through visits and other forms of contact. The takeaway messages for trauma and children in the child welfare system who have incarcerated parents are: trauma causes brain chemistry and architecture changes that create behavioral reactions in children that cause problems for them, for their education, for their relationships in the community. Children of incarcerated parents experience the loss of that parent to incarceration as trauma, significant trauma closely related to trauma of the loss of a parent to death. Unlike dealing with the loss of a loved one to death, children who lose a parent to the criminal justice system have very few supports around them to help them cope with the loss. A primary buffer for children in the aftermath of trauma is the primary attachment figure, who, for these kids, is the incarcerated parent. And so connection to that parent, visits with that parent, are key often to the child coping in the aftermath of trauma.